It's actually extraordinary how sanguine and how accepting the British public overall are about immigrants and about immigration, which I think is precisely why irregular migration, which is not controlled, has to be seen to have a zero tolerance policy. Yeah. Because I think the problem is that when you have that sense of lawlessness at the border, what it does is it infect the debate on standard migration, on regular migration, on legal migration.
You can't tell the British people they're wrong to feel absolutely furious about the small boat arrivals. And I think that politically it is just an imperative that somehow, by whatever means, the government deals with this. It's John.
It's Emily.
It's Lewis.
So the past 24, 48 hours have been pretty shocking in terms of Keir Starmer's promise to smash the gangs because, of course, there's the one in, one out policy that was agreed with the French. And one of the people that was sent out from Britain, having arrived on a small boat, guess what? Was back on a small boat yesterday. And as well as that, we've heard overnight the French government sort of saying, yeah, I know we're being paid all this money to do all this stuff on the French beaches, but it's all spin really. We're not going to be wading into the water to slash any boats. We're just there to kind of make it look like we're doing something, but we're not really doing anything. And all of this comes at a time when the number of people arriving on small boats has hit a record high.
So I guess the question I have in all this is that we have always gone back to the principle that the thing that made the small boats so much worse, so much harder, was the post-Brexit settlement, which left us out on our own. You know, we didn't really have friends. Boris Johnson had done his level best to really piss off the French, amongst others. And certainly in the last sort of 18 months, the whole tenor of the conversation and the sort of relationship has changed. Let's try and work, you know, whether it was Rishi Sunak actually with the Windsor Agreement, whether it's Keir Starmer with Macron now, let's try and get our neighbours back on side. Let's try and work together. The one in, one out thing, yes, it's only about one poor fella kind of, you know, going and coming back. But it does seem to suggest that the thing that we were holding out for, which was returns agreements, isn't actually as rock solid as it should be. And I don't understand what's changed.
Well, I think it's a really interesting one. I've sort of been reporting on the small boats thing almost since it started, and it really started sort of in earnest in the kind of 2019 sort of 2020 period. And I think it is a fair question because, you know, people will think, well, why didn't we have this before, right? Like, why has this over the last 5 years become so toxic and become so visible? And it has become deeply politically toxic. And I think if you speak to people at the heart of the government, they believe that this thing, even more than the economy, has the potential to destabilise, continue to metastasize and destabilise their own political chances ahead of the next election. So it is important. I mean, I think the answer to the question is like, this has always existed in one form or another, and it's complicated, but before you had small boats, you had lorries. People used to come over on lorries, which meant that it wasn't nearly as visible. You've also seen increased movement around the world by comparison to even, 10 years ago or 15 years ago. Migratory flows and migratory pressures have become worse and more complicated. And on top of that, I mean, you mentioned the Brexit thing. I mean, this is the hard one to kind of untangle a little bit.
Yeah.
Because we did have agreements with the EU. We had the Dublin Convention, which technically would allow us to return people to the EU country of origin where they first disembarked from wherever they came from. The truth is that we didn't use those conventions that much, and sometimes it meant that we had to take people as well. But you can, of course, make an argument to say that there was knowledge of, among people who might try and cross on small boats, there was a knowledge that those arrangements did exist, so they were more likely to be returned. So you could argue that it was a deterrent, and people, some people would say that it is no coincidence that this problem has been getting worse since we left those arrangements. It's also true to say that the whole of Europe has been suffering more from this problem in the round as well. So it's complicated. It's a bit of everything.
So the question I guess it begs is, if we had the Rwanda scheme and if it had got up and running, well, there is no question that the bloke who came in, was sent back to France and then came back in again, would have been doing that. He would have been in Rwanda, presumably. And would that have acted as the deterrent? Maybe the Conservative government was right. Maybe that would have been the way. to have kind of dealt with the problem and sort of limited the demand for people to come across on small boats, because they'd have thought, oh God, I'm going to end up in Rwanda if I do this.
I think that the problem with this debate very often is that people talk about, the Home Office will talk about push factors and pull factors, the things that are pushing people from their countries of origin, and the things that are, once they've been pushed, attracting them to the UK. And the problem, I think, often in the politics of this, the way it's discussed, is that one side or the other just focuses on either pull or push and doesn't focus on both. And the truth is, it is both. So with Rwanda, I think, is a really, really good example. Look, it is possible that Rwanda would have limited the pull factor, because you would say, look, if you end up here, there is a possibility that you end up in Rwanda. And even if you come here, and this was the novel thing about Rwanda, right? It wasn't just offshore processing. It was offshore processing, and then once you're processed, whether you deserve asylum or not, you stay there.
There is no route into the UK.
There's no route into the UK if you arrive irregularly, i.e. via small boat or whatever. That was what was unusual about it. The truth is, though, is that, and it would have obviously been harder and taken longer, but I will bet you absolutely anything that even with Rwanda, people who were sent to Rwanda, if it had happened, would have ended up back in the UK. They would have done what happened with France, i.e. they would have gone all the way to Rwanda, and it would have taken longer, but sooner or later they would have tried their luck again to go back to the UK. Because that's what you're dealing with here. You're dealing with people who are, for whatever reason, sometimes because they're fleeing persecution, sometimes because they want access to British labour markets, sometimes because they've got family here and want to be united with their family. Whatever it happens to be, you're dealing with people who are highly, highly determined. So yeah, it would be harder to get back from Rwanda than just being sent back to Calais, of course. But you would find that. You would absolutely be guaranteed to find people. That's what you're dealing with here. And it's a really difficult thing for anyone to deal with.
Another question then. If the Tories had managed to get the scheme up and running before the election, and we can go back over the timing of the election date and when Rishi Sunak, fired the starting gun for the 24 election, and should he have waited longer and get the Rwanda scheme up and running? But if the Rwanda scheme had been up and running, do you think Labour would have still cancelled it if they thought it was being effective in any way?
I've spoken to people in the heart of the government about this at various different points, and they are insisting, and they continue to insist to this day, that Rwanda would never have worked, because legally it wouldn't have worked, because ultimately Labour were not going to do what Generic or someone like that might have done, which is to leave the ECHR. Starmer would never have done that, not least because there will continue to be such profound questions about how that would impact on Good Friday Agreement, because it's written into Good Friday Agreement. So once you accept that, it wouldn't have worked. And even then they say that the actual numbers, yes, it was 300 initially Rwanda had sort of carved out for it. Yes, the Rwandan government said in the end it's possible that you could have had sort of far more, but actually it wouldn't have absorbed, it wouldn't have been that massive deterrent, because it would have still been relatively small numbers. I think where the political critique that I would make, and I've heard some other people make, is to say that it may not have been a bad idea, just politically, if nothing else, to allow the Rwanda scheme, which was supposed to be imminent, to play out. And those things then to have happened, because then at least you would be able to turn around to the Tories and to Reform now and say, look, we tried your way and it didn't work. What it basically allowed them to do was a get out of jail free card, where they now turn around. I've done it myself. We've all done it, with Tories or Reform. And you turn around to them and say, well, what's your solution? They said, well, we had a solution. It was Rwanda, and it was shut down. So I think politically, if not in policy terms, they made a mistake.
I was speaking to somebody very close to the Prime Minister today, and I put your question to them in those words. Is there a world in which Labour wishes they'd let Rwanda run just to see how it played out? And the response that came back was, maybe in Shabana Mahmood's mind, in other words, the Home Secretary, would have quite liked to see that, would have quite liked to be on that sort of wing, but not in Keir Starmer's. He's always wanted to do return deals with democratic Europe under the ECHR. And I think that word democratic is working pretty hard there to remind us that Keir Starmer comes to this, as a lawyer, as a barrister, as a former head of the DPP. And it was really important to him that he played nicely with the courts, and that it was done within a scheme, within a sort of framework of good relations, rather than sort of punitive, seedy, underhand deals with countries that, we paid ridiculous amounts of money to and got nothing from.
But so to go back to where we started, which was to talk about what's happened, with this person coming back into the country after they were, sent away to France as part of the one in, one out arrangement, what the French government are or aren't doing, and the police are or aren't doing on the French coastline. I mean, the present system is not working, and you've got Shabana Mahmood. I think she told the Times that the Home Office isn't fit for purpose, and I kind of thought, oh, we're kind of back to John Reid and when he was Home Secretary and saying
he said that in 2006.
Yeah, exactly.
Still not,
and it's still not. And you think this department that has got such a huge amount to deal with is somehow still not rising to the challenge that it faces.
Two things I'd say. The whole question of small boats has taken up a huge amount of political oxygen in our language and in our sort of conversations over the last 3 years. It's a reminder that it is, I think, between 4 and 6% of all the immigration. 4% of the immigrants who come to this country are doing so in small boats illegally. You can say that's 4% too many. You can say the numbers are bigger, but in the big scheme of immigration, it is very, very small. If people are genuinely worried about the numbers of immigrants, then, there is another conversation to be having there. The other thing is something that the Bulgarian government said in the last few days, which is that they offered proof that they think that Putin, the Russian administration government, is working with smugglers to flood Europe with migrants. In other words, this whole idea of destabilisation coming once again from Russian interference. We've seen it play out in elections, we've seen it play out in referendum, we've seen it play out in many different ways over the course of the last 10, 15 years. And there is a sense that this is all part of a bigger Putin strategy to kind of make countries question their own democratic governments and say, we can destabilise you by flooding the market with illegals.
I think that there is a growing kind of radicalisation within government, is my impression, about what they might need to do. And I think there is I think in a way the small boat stuff is quite a good parable for some of the wider defects and movements that you've seen in terms of how Starmer and Labour came to office. I think there was a genuine belief, again, as within so many other things, when Starmer came in and his team came in, that the Tories had simply been deeply ideological, deeply incompetent, and a little bit of, which in many cases was true, but a little bit of elbow grease and bonhomie and good humour and good relations with the French and the EU might sort this out. And of course, it has done some things. There have been some advancements made, and it is absolutely true to say that relations were kind of rock bottom through many of the periods of the Boris Johnson period and so on, and you needed something to do. But I think nonetheless, I think that particularly with the new Home Secretary, they have been, and she said it herself publicly, but they have been deeply dispirited by the state of the Home Office. I think Shabana, my understanding is that she feels deeply frustrated by the kind of the way the Home Office operates and by a sort of sense of drift within the department on doing something about this. And I think she thinks as well that she hasn't got long to turn this around, not only for the government's fortunes, but of course for her political fortunes as well, being talked up as she is a great deal as a potential leadership candidate. She knows... With
a very unsafe seat, it has to be said.
With a very unsafe seat now. It used to be absolutely safe as houses in Birmingham Ladywood, but yeah, against with potential challenges from the Greens or who knows. So, she... I think there is an awareness of that, and I think that as a result, we're led to believe that in a couple of weeks, she's going to be coming forward with a whole new set of measures and proposals, which I think are going to be uncomfortable, particularly on the legal side of things, and the potential, who knows, even disapplication of parts of the ECHR, which is not something I think this government would have countenanced or considered 12 months ago, and will be uncomfortable for the Attorney General, Lord Hermer, who's one of Keir Starmer's best friends, who is someone who has, prized much of this stuff in terms of international law and so on. And, as you say, Emily, Keir Starmer himself, who, at his core, fundamentally, is an international lawyer. That is where his sort of politics sits and is, and anything on that will make him uncomfortable. But I think he is being won over by people like Mahmood, among others.
Emily, you made the perfectly reasonable point about the small percentage that is represented by those arriving illegally on small boats. But I do think it has outsized importance. I do think it is, you can't tell the British people they're wrong to feel absolutely furious about the small boat arrivals. And I think that politically it is just an imperative that somehow, by whatever means, the government deals with this. And it'll be interesting to see what Shabana Mahmood because I think it offends so many people. The idea that there are these boats arriving, that them being put up in hotels, I think it really offends a huge section of the British public. And it feels like a real failure of politics if you cannot secure your own borders. And we saw the way it played out in America. It was absolute rocket fuel for Donald Trump in the last November's election, when he was saying that Joe Biden has let everyone come in across the southern border. It is just the same here.
I totally agree that any government and any country has to prove that they have control of their own borders. But I'd also remind you, since you remember Donald Trump, that in 2018, just before the midterm elections, he managed to draw everyone's attention, all the media's attention, every camera person's attention to the southern border, where he said there was a big caravan forming. And he took the attention of everyone that was covering news at that time and said, this is happening now. It wasn't, actually. There was nothing that was happening at that time which suggested that there had been a surge in immigration in 2018 in a big caravan coming up from Venezuela. That literally wasn't true.
But it was in 2024. There had been a huge number of people who'd crossed the southern border during the Biden administration. That's just fact.
Well, all I would say is we genuinely don't know. I think people are absolutely allowed to feel uncomfortable and concerned about things that they don't control. But genuinely, we don't know how significant immigration really is in most people's lives and how much it has been talked up to help the political fortunes of the hard right. People who have much to gain from destabilising a government, from destabilising people's perceptions of whether they can, control their own lives. And I think we have to be super aware of that. We have to be super, super aware that this is something that when you ask people locally, do you care? Do you see a lot of immigration in your own quarter? Does that worry you? They say no. Is it a big problem on the national stage? Yes. Now, where does that come from? That comes from a massive gap between a media narrative and what people are actually experiencing in their own lives. And I think we've got to be really acute and aware of that.
I would just say that it's such spectacular television to see people getting onto these small boats that are packed and then coming across the channel and landing in wherever.
No one wants to see immigrants dying at sea, 100%. But don't forget that was exactly what the Daily Mail did during the Brexit referendum. And I actually confronted both Lord Rothermere and David Cameron because a story had emerged at the time that said Cameron had asked Rothermere to stop showing those pictures because that was driving the Brexit debate. And actually, they both admitted it did. They wanted those pictures to stop because they knew what it was doing. And it wasn't doing it before the pictures were driving the narrative. That's my point.
Yeah, I think that in a way, I think both things can be true in a sense that I agree that obviously, and I've sort of moved on this even myself, sort of thinking about the relative importance of it, because I think it is important to stress that we're talking about relatively small numbers of people, particularly in the both the European context, where many other countries often take more than we do. We sometimes have this narrative that somehow Britain is a kind of uniquely soft touch and that we are uniquely taking loads and loads of people. No, this is a continental-wide problem that probably requires continental-wide solutions, which might have been one of the good reasons to, if we were still in the room when much of this sort of the EU border policy is being discussed. But, that's by the by now. But I think it is also true to say that even though it is a small number of people, I think because, actually, I think most British people are relatively pro-immigration in the abstract. I think most British people actually have been, when you consider how big the waves of immigration have been, particularly since COVID, at one point nearing the sort of net migration of nearly 1 million. It's actually extraordinary how sanguine and how accepting the British public overall are about immigrants and about immigration, which I think is precisely why, and Shabana Mahmood has made this argument herself, and I agree with her, it's precisely why irregular migration, which is not controlled, has to be seen to have a zero tolerance policy. Yeah. Because I think the problem is that when you have that sense of lawlessness at the border, what it does is it infect the debate on standard migration, on regular migration, on legal migration, and it metastasizes because you have, bad actors, including people like Tommy Robinson and others, who then use the relatively small number for their own purposes, basically to
smear all immigrants,
smear and 100%. Demonise the much larger number. So I think
I would say though is if you got rid of the small boats problem completely, you would not shut down Tommy Robinson, and I think that is the big mistake.
Oh, I think you'd minimise his. I think that one of his recruiting kind of tools is the small boats. And I think that if you could deal with it,
100% he would start on a different track, on a
sure,
different one.
but it would be less fertile. It would be less
I
productive.
can understand. I mean, look,
I don't think people go to him because they think that he's got a really good logical argument. I think people go to him because, he waves a flag and talks about grievances, and he can always find another grievance in the British public. And he will.
And he will. And he absolutely will. And people like him always will. But this is such a fertile one. And it's one, I mean, let's be honest as well. You can understand, like, if you're sat somewhere in Britain and you're struggling to make ends meet, and then suddenly you do see on TV and you see people like Robinson make the argument, these people are arriving out of nowhere and they get put up in hotels. And sometimes they are decent hotels, whatever. And just trying to
they're your
explain,
hotels. It's your hotels.
Trying to explain that to someone who might be receiving nothing from the state, when you have someone who's just arrived here out of nowhere, even if they are a deserving refugee, that's hard, right? And I suppose the point is that if you can shut that down, and my worry is that I don't know if it can be shut down in its entirety, just because of the global factors, and no other country has been particularly successful at it yet. But if you could shut it down, at least then liberal, progressive, mainstream forces could have the argument about immigration, legal migration in the round,
without
which
getting
is
pulled into a control.
Which is an easier argument to win and to have. And indeed, you can take on the really extreme stuff that we were talking about yesterday, which is starting to become more mainstream, which is going after people who are legally settled here and have been given legal basis to stay in the UK, which actually all of the polling suggests most British people find deeply extreme.
While we're on the subject of what is the truth about what is happening, we're going to be talking to Jimmy Wales, the founder of Wikipedia, about how there is trust, how there is society, how people are quite kind, and that we should dial down the rhetoric.
And we've gone a whole episode without mentioning Prince Andrew. That's for you, Rory Stewart. If you get it, you get it. We'll be back in a second.
Well, we are joined in the studio now by the founder of Wikipedia, Jimmy Wales. And Jimmy, you've just written a book about the foundations of Wikipedia, but it's a bigger book than that, it feels to me. It's also about the idea of trust and human nature, which I'm sure a lot of people would say, looking at the present tone of debate in this world, they'd think you're wrong. We're not all kind and nice towards one another.
Well, I mean, we certainly aren't all kind and nice to each other, but the premise of the book is that trust is super important. It still exists, and we need to bring it back and build it up in society more broadly.
And that is your basis on which Wikipedia grew, which was that people would contribute online to this, the world's biggest encyclopedia, the first online encyclopedia, all of that. And that it would be done by people who had a shared sense of truth.
Yeah, and that's what we've been doing ever since. I mean, from the very earliest days of Wikipedia, there was this idea that, we have to trust people. And that's not blind trust. You have to sort of think about what to do when something goes wrong. But broadly, we all know in normal day-to-day life, we meet people all the time. Most people are perfectly nice and trustworthy. And we just have to think about, how do we bring that out in people? How do we sustain that? How do we support that? How do we make it a little more costly to do something bad and a little easier to do something good?
So take us back to the beginning, Jimmy, because the word you come back to is reliability. In other words, trust only works if it's very practical, if people actually do the thing that they say they will do. If you rent somebody's house on Airbnb, you trust that the house exists, otherwise the whole model falls apart. If you book an Uber, the Uber has to come, it has to be there, it has to be reliable. But with something like this, the project is about relying on people to put in details to a massive system that are going to be correct. And when you started this, I mean, it could have just been a cesspit of misinformation, right? Frankly, that's what it could have been.
Well, I mean, in the very earliest days, there was no way to be sure. And I actually did assume in the very, very beginning that, this is like a little side scratchpad project, and we'll have to figure out, and there'll have to be an editor-in-chief of the China history section, and we'll have to figure that out. But as it turned out, people come, and by and large, they do the right things. I mean, you have to think about what are you going to do about vandalism and how do you deal with the problems. But largely, when we look at edits from people who aren't even logged in, they aren't quite as good as the edits of experienced Wikipedians. But on net, they're improving the encyclopedia. So sometimes you'll see an anonymous IP address makes an edit to Wikipedia, and, what is it? They actually just cleared up the grammar in a phrase, or they added a link to a source, or, small edits like that. And you're like, wow, that's great. Like somebody's just chipping in.
So are you seeing everything? Are you kind of like Jimmy Almighty? I mean, how many people do you employ that actually come and fact check and work and call their own professional work Wikipedia?
Well, we do have several hundred employees, but they're not editing the encyclopedia. So, some of them do, and when they go home, because we hired from the community and so forth. But everything you see on the website, including what's chosen to be on the front page, the picture of the day and all of that kind of thing, that's all done by the volunteer community. And no one at the Wikimedia Foundation is tasked with deciding the content of the encyclopedia.
Okay, so if I decide to come on and I get up the biographies of, let's say, 10 famous men, and I change each one at the end to say, he was a Nazi. How quickly would you spot that? How long would it stay up for before somebody was like, huh?
Yeah, what we always say is, please don't try that, but probably 5 minutes max.
Is that right?
It would be very, very quick. And, I think if you did it once, hopefully you would get a nice friendly message saying, hey, don't do that, knock it off. We're trying to make an encyclopedia here. If you did it 10 times in succession, you'd just probably be blocked quite quickly. Because we have a lot of systems in place. So we have the recent changes patrollers. So these are people who just sit on recent changes. These are all volunteers, mind you, and they're just checking things that come in.
I haven't done anything illegal, have I? If I've done that, have I done
Well,
anything?
you're
breaking the law.
libeling someone potentially.
Calling people Nazis is generally not okay, but
well,
it would probably
used
just
to
be
not be
reverted.
okay. I mean, it's. I mean, this is part of the thing, though, isn't it? You're
Exactly. The whole idea of shared truth now, which is that the idea that Wikipedia is a reliable, accessible. There are those on the far right who don't think it is. They think it's biased and they think it's skewed to the left and overwhelmingly liberal and just giving you the liberal version of the world.
Yeah, and there are those on the far left who think the same thing, But yeah, there's a lot of noise about that sort of thing. And, what I always say, so first of all, if people have the idea that Wikipedia has been taken over by left-wing activists, that's just not true. If you have the idea that some of the Wikipedia entries are one-sided and should be more balanced, okay, well, we need to grapple with that. We need to actually check that and go through the details. And, we want people to come and engage and say, what about this source? What about that source? I mean, there's a lot of open questions in society where it's quite easy to say, we've overlooked this part of the argument or that part of the argument. And it's important that we maintain an intellectual willingness and curiosity to say, let's see, how can we do better here? And if we don't, and if we just get defensive and say, no, we're not biased,
so
that doesn't really help.
I mean, something, let's say, vaccine hesitancy. Like, where would you sort of find that place? Would you talk about the problems with like COVID vaccinations? Would you? I mean, how? I guess I can go check.
What about Tylenol? Tylenol causing, autism.
Yeah, no, I mean, what I would suspect, I haven't looked up that one. So vaccines I can speak about a little more authoritatively. This was a fairly new sort of odd thing that was said. Apparently there was one study. I think we would probably treat it as, as we do in these cases. It's like, here's the evidence, here's the competing claims around it. We shouldn't take a side if there's any question whatsoever. Certainly for something like vaccine hesitancy as a topic in and of itself, I hope there's an article called Vaccine Hesitancy, which goes through like, here's the stats on people who are hesitant, here are the reasons they give, and and that many of the reasons are not scientifically valid and so forth should also be a part of that. One of the examples that I really like is, the question of masks in
COVID
public health settings,
okay,
COVID masks. And what's interesting is this is where I come down. So then I'll explain how Wikipedia handles this. Is like in hospital settings with healthcare workers properly trained wearing quality masks, there is good, strong evidence that it reduces transmission. During COVID, when people were jumping on the tube, half-ass wearing their mask, sort of wearing, sort of not, was that really helping or not? The evidence is very mixed as to whether that did any good whatsoever. And then, unfortunately, that became super politicized, I would say, especially in America, not so much here, but when, actually, if your approach should be to sort of say what I just said. Just say, like, okay, actually, the evidence is mixed here. There's evidence one way or the other. You wouldn't want to say, as a lot of the health authorities did, like the first they said, masks don't do any good. Please don't go out rushing buying masks. And then a few weeks later, we're all told you must wear masks all the time. And that undermined trust that the public had. It's like, well, hold on, you said masks didn't help, and now you're saying masks are mandatory. Like, why did you say that? And the reason they said it is they didn't trust the public to not panic and go out and buy up all the masks so there wouldn't be any for healthcare workers.
I've actually just looked up Tylenol, which is it's interesting because there's a general introduction about what Tylenol is, and says, it's just a painkiller, it's an analgesic, la 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 la.
Paracetamol.
Yeah, and uses names like paracetamol and, etc. Then it goes, and I look at history, and it says, the first thing it says under history, see also false or misleading statements by Donald Trump.
Great.
I mean,
that sounds pretty good.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that statement, so that link right there.
Someone would say that's biased. The president would say that this. I'm saying this with the authority of the president of the United States, with the Department of Health and Human Services secretary.
Why would they say it's biased? Because it's been discredited as a link.
Yeah. False. Yeah. Well, of course he would say it's biased, but I don't know how we can help him. He shouldn't go around saying false things. Yeah. So, but the fact that link is there in the article, that is probably very temporary. We know there's a lot of interest in that subject. People are coming in to read about Tylenol. They're not just randomly thinking of it. They're like, oh, I saw this thing in the news. And then eventually that link would probably go away because it's not really relevant to Tylenol. Like, it's a blip in the news.
Is that right? So you'd actually take it out?
I think somebody will eventually to say, oh, that was a big news story a couple of years ago, but actually it's not a thing. It'll be changed to one sentence and a link. And,
I suppose it's what leads to the other part of the conversation, which is kind of, is Wikipedia done in an age of AI? But not just in an age of AI, in an age where in the attention economy, you don't get any points for saying that's not quite right. What I think you need to say is this: you need to slam somebody. You need to be, and you look at the way Elon Musk has weaponized X, and you think, wow, well, that's a very different model from the Wikipedia one.
Yeah, and it is troubling, and I think it's, what we see though is that there is a real passion, with the public for clear, reliable information. And a lot of the systems online aren't supporting that and fostering that and so forth, but it's still there. I mean, we know people, one of the positive signs I'm seeing, which I think is really fantastic, is the growth in the interest that people have in podcasts, because podcasts aren't that kind of clickbaity, short form. Like, people are like, actually, I want to engage with ideas. I want to learn. I want to think. I want to,
That's why you're here, Jimmy.
You're not just saying that to schmooze us, are you?
Oh, it really is definitely partly that. And also you're very smart and good-looking listeners. But
Jimmy, let me ask you something though. If you had to name the tech bros of the world, and a lot of people could do that, they'd point to the inauguration lineup behind Trump, and they'd say, yeah, we get it, Sam Altman and Elon Musk and Mark Zuckerberg. They wouldn't necessarily say Jimmy Wales from Wikipedia, and yet you have done something absolutely revolutionary. They've all become billionaires. Last time I checked, I don't know if you have, but I don't think you did.
That I'm aware of.
Right. I mean, do you look at them wistfully and think, Jesus, why didn't I make that serious money? Or do you think they're arse?
No, neither of those actually. But no, I don't, because my life is so interesting. I mean, it's really great fun to be me, and I get to talk to all kinds of interesting people, and I go around the world.
You make a great brunch, by the way.
I make a great brunch, and I've got all kinds of amazing friends, and it's just great. And actually, on the question of money, I always say, look, here I live in London. How many bankers are there in London who make far more money than I ever will? And their lives must be unbelievably boring. They must be very tedious. Whereas, I get to do all kinds of fun things. I know all kinds of interesting people.
But you don't wish you'd actually monetised it more? I mean, do you still own Wikipedia?
No. We're a charity, so we're a non-profit organization. I donated it all in there, and I'm a volunteer on that front. So I don't have a salary. I'm just me.
So there have been talks that Elon Musk has kind of wanted to buy Wikipedia. Is it for sale?
It is not for sale.
Never?
There was actually no, never. No.
Has he approached you?
Not really. What happened was a journalist, a New York Post journalist, said, "Oh, Elon, you should just buy Wikipedia," and I just replied, "Not for sale." That tweet was my most successful tweet ever. It was really people loved that, and it was like, okay, great.
It's got its own Wikipedia page.
Yeah, probably does. And no, actually, it's a funny thing. I used to be on the board of the Guardian, and they sometimes at the bottom of the Guardian, where they ask you for a donation, they have recently had one that said not for sale. I was like, wonder where you got that.
But just going back to Musk,
yeah,
you've obviously known him for a long time.
Yeah, not well, but yeah, I've known him. Yeah.
What do you think of the journey he's been on, what he's done, the way it's changed?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard. I mean, the thing is that what I have to say is, trying to figure out what is going on in Elon Musk's head is a fool's errand. I have no idea what he's thinking. And he's obviously very clever and very talented, and he's done some amazing things. I mean, sometimes people ask me, do you have any advice for Elon Musk? And I'm always like, yeah, remember that electric car thing? That was a good idea. You should focus on that. Even the space stuff is good. I mean, I just think he probably should back away from a lot of the other stuff he's doing, because it's not great.
I mean, it's not great is probably our favourite understatement of the podcast so far. But, I mean, it asks a really serious question, Jimmy, which is, could Wikipedia have been founded today? In the place that we are now, a totally different age of truth and maybe even of civic responsibility. Do you think?
I do think so. I mean, but I always say I'm a pathological optimist. So we have to remember that. I always think everything's going to be fine and people are great and there's all kinds of amazing stuff going on.
And do you think it is fine? Do you think it is great?
Not everything, for sure. But, in the book I talk about, there's a subreddit called Change My View. And it's this amazing. And Reddit, I love Reddit, but Reddit is some of the best and some of the worst places on the internet. And in Change My View, people come in and they post some statement. They say, oh, here's my statement. Maybe they're a little provocative and they just say, this is what I think. Change my view. And then there's rules in the way people do it. And there's a sort of culture there. Even people who may agree with that statement will come in and say, oh, have you thought of this? Have you thought of that? And try and challenge it. And it's really amazing. You get these really interesting threads about, and sometimes people at the end, they go, yeah, you changed my mind. Or more often maybe, I sort of changed my mind a little bit on parts of this, but I still believe what I believed. And I just think that's great. Now, all these people are doing it just for fun. They're just interesting people who like sort of intellectual discourse in a respectful setting. And that's fantastic. And, we can lament the rise of short form content, but people are also binging really long, really complicated TV shows. So there are a lot of hopeful signs, even things like, the rise of people paying subscriptions for news feels really important to me, because the advertising only model really was sending us down a really sort of weird, bad, clickbaity world, where the most important thing is getting people to go viral and click and all that. And all that can still exist. But at the same time, people are saying, no, actually, I would like to just get some news, please. That would be great.
For our viewers that don't know, you have an American accent, but you live in Britain. You sort of straddle a British-American family. So I guess you have views both sides of the Atlantic, Jimmy. And one of the things we know about you is that you're close to the royal family here.
Yeah.
So can we ask you how, the story that is dominating at the moment is what's going to happen to Prince Andrew, what's going to happen to his family, what's going to happen to his residents. Do you think he's been vilified? Do you think he's been scapegoated? Or do you think he should pack up and move out?
Well, it's hard for me to really comment. Clearly, he's made some very bad judgment calls with his friendships over the years. I'm mainly friends with Beatrice, and she's lovely and amazing. And, I think most people realize shouldn't hold anything against the daughters. They're very sweet. But yeah, Andrew, I don't know. I mean, I think it is a good thing that he's sort of said he's going to step back from the titles and this and that, but I don't know what that really means. It feels like it means a lot to British people. For some people, you just go, well, it's just a title, so what, but yeah.
And how do you think the daughters have been affected?
I don't know, really. Beatrice is doing very well in her career, so that's kind of good. She's, working with AI companies, and yeah, quite cool. But, who knows, it's got to be difficult. I think, actually, I feel for many people in that family, Harry and William, whatever, oh my God, every single private quarrel you might have in the family is global headlines. It must be exhausting. So, yeah, there we go.
Jimmy Wales, great to speak to you.
Yeah,
Thank
lovely.
you.
Thank you very much indeed.
Great.
Right, that's it from all of us for today. We are going to be back tomorrow for a full sit-down conversation with Jens Stoltenberg. Jens Stoltenberg, one of the stalwarts of European politics, global politics, former Prime Minister of Norway, but most germanely, of course, he was the leader of NATO when the full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine began in 2022. He's just published a book. We're going to be talking about that, his relationship with President Trump, with President Biden, Boris Johnson, and of course, how the war in Ukraine might end. That is coming up tomorrow. We'll see you then. Bye-bye.
The Newsagents. This is a Global Player original podcast.